All right, today we're going to look at the fourth doctrine in the system of doctrine known as Calvinism. We looked at the T of the tulip acrostic, total depravity. We looked at the U, unconditional election. We looked at the L, limited atonement. And now we're looking at the I, which is irresistible grace. This is, I keep saying this is one of the most misunderstood points. They're all misunderstood in a lot of different ways, but unfortunately the phraseology, irresistible grace, is prone to be misunderstood because for some people it conjures up this idea of people being reduced to puppets or robots. God pushing levers and people just doing what they're pre-programmed to do without any real volition on their part. That's not what's meant by irresistible grace. Some people prefer the term effectual grace. And the benefit of that phrase is effectual grace means that this is a grace that always brings about its intended effect. In other words, it always does what God intends for it to do. It accomplishes what God sets out for it to accomplish. And human sin, human rebellion can't thwart it. Human pride, human stubbornness can't resist it. It always accomplishes what God sets out for it to accomplish. Yeah, but what is irresistible grace? So the basis for this doctrine, well, let's backtrack. We talked about how the human race is totally depraved, which means we're born in a state of sin. Our hearts are corrupt, our hearts are bent, our hearts are turned away from God. We talked about how, because of that, we can't turn ourselves to God apart from the grace of God. And we talked about how, according to Calvinism, God gives His regenerating grace to some, and those whom He gives it to turn to Him. He does not give that regenerating grace to everyone indiscriminately, and those that God passes over receive God's justice rather than His mercy. And then we talked about how the atonement, to use the phrase that was first used at the Synod of Dort, which was a church council back in 1619, Christ's atonement is sufficient for all, but efficient only for the elect, which means it has the power to atone for all, but in actual practice, when it's all said and done, only those who have been chosen by God and who've been given regenerating grace will in fact benefit from the atonement. So, keeping in mind all that, irresistible grace is referring to the grace that God gives to those whom He has chosen to redeem. And the point of this doctrine is that regenerating grace that God gives to His chosen people can't be resisted finally and ultimately. All of us do resist God's grace at times, and many people who eventually come to faith in Christ only do so after having resisted it for many, many years. But the point of this doctrine is that if God has decided to redeem someone by giving to this person His regenerating grace, that plan was not going to be thwarted. It's going to actually come to fruition. And the rationale behind that is that if human pride, if human sinfulness could resist the good grace of God, it always would resist it. So the only kind of grace that can in fact save us is a grace that can't be resisted, because if it could, it would. The biblical rationale behind this doctrine is John chapter 6, where Jesus says, "All those the Father gives to me will come to me. And whoever comes to me I will no wise cast out." So this is teaching that God is not trying to draw the entire world to Himself and only succeeding occasionally. All those the Father gives to Christ, all those the Father draws to Christ, do in fact come. All those the Father gives to Him come. And that's a great comfort, because as we share the gospel, a criticism of Calvinism is that it undermines evangelism, but if properly understood, it doesn't. Because the idea is that we preach the message as believers, but God's grace is what actually accomplishes the work. And the grace of God will in fact accomplish what God desires for it to accomplish. And everything doesn't hinge on us. It's all about God's grace.